Yeah, everyone, well, thank you for coming. I know it's 9 o'clock, and hopefully we'll get more people as it progresses a little bit. But this is one of the joint panels for two of our working groups. China working group, which Sam-Kee runs, and the Political Economy of Industrial Development working group, which is run by, which is run by Lorenza Monaco, me, and Tobias Franz. So we have three presentations today, and we'll do it for about 20 minutes each. I'll try and keep time, but we have time. So, I mean, that I guess 20 minutes is more than enough, hopefully. And yeah, we'll have questions at the end. Yeah.
Thank you.
So first we'll have Sam-Kee.
Thank you. Let me share the screen first. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the session. My name is Sam-Kee Cheng. I've recently started working at the University of Macau. So I came from Macau for the conference this time. I've been in the IIPPE conference for quite a number of years, so some familiar faces. So very happy to be here again and presenting my paper. I have been doing research on the political economy of China. That was my PhD. And after that, I'm starting to think about how to make it more linked to the other developments in the world, especially in the anti-imperialist struggles. So that is how I started with looking at the Irish history. That's my first attempt. So maybe more familiar with the Chinese history, not so much in Ireland, but I think I would just start this attempt and try to tell you the reasons why I'm doing this, and hopefully you find it interesting and also useful maybe in some of your research. So the abstract of the paper is this: based on a Marxist analysis and an analytical framework and comparing the revolutionary history in Ireland and China in the early 20th century, the paper argues that for societies of belated development, where natural development was truncated by colonialism, social revolutions led by the proletariat in alliance with the peasantry, not by the bourgeoisie, is the basis for national independence and development. As we know, capitalism began in Western Europe. Britain came to dominate the world with its successful campaigns against its competitors for colonies and its explosive growth of industrial power. After the bourgeois revolution, the state played an increasingly important role in maintaining capitalist rule and the seizure of market by military expansion. Ireland was the first British colony. Settlers from Scotland and England were brought in to establish colonial landlordism from the 16th century. So the very famous one is the Ulster plantation, which began from the 17th century. You can see the map here. Yes. People from Scotland and England were brought in to start plantation, and the local Irish people were driven away from the land, the fertile land, and were moved to the marginal and bauxite, the mountains, and also very sandy, rocky land. So that is the beginning of English colonialism in Ireland. By the end of the 17th century, as Marx said in Capital Volume 1, England arrived at a systematical combination embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, for example, the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society to hasten hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. The penal laws passed by the Britain in 1695 forbade the practice of Catholicism and the use of Gaelic language. and most importantly, stripped the Catholic Irish of their holdings, including lands, which resulted in poverty across the country and mass immigration. I think we are all familiar with the Great Famine that in 1845, that estimated of about 2 million of Irish people either died from starvation or immigrated out of a population of just slightly over 8 million. Colonialism brutally truncated the path of natural development and destroyed any form of subsistence production in the colonized lands, as they were forced to accept specialization of production in the interest of the colonial powers and to compete in the world commodity market. The world was divided into national blocks based on the difference in natural conditions and the uneven development of productive forces. By the end of 19th century, capitalism entered what Lenin called its final, the monopoly stage of capitalism. Western finance capital, arising from the merger of bank capital and industrial capital, sought to generate enormous super profits through exploiting the labor and resources of foreign colonies, leading to the domination and concentration of finance capital by a social stratum of rentiers in the most powerful states. Overseas expansion is not only driven by the need for resources production and new markets for profit, but also by the need to monopolize these gains. This led to the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers before the First World War. China at that time was partitioned into various spheres of influence, where extraterritorial rights were granted to the powers which carried out policing patrols in Chinese territory and held colonies and concessions. The emergence of capitalist imperialism did not merely exacerbate the uneven development in the world, but also created a revolutionary class in the colonies, the proletariat. This new proletariat, despite its numerous links with pre-capitalist societies, was to become a vanguard of the international workers' movement, subverting the Second International schema of historical development. The law of uneven and combined development encapsulated the coexistence and interpenetration of different stages of historic development. Trotsky used this to explain the motive forces of Russian Revolution. The Russian bourgeoisie was dependent on foreign capital and relied on the autocracy for protection against the workers' movement and the peasant masses. Consequently, the Russian bourgeoisie could not play the part of the English and French in overthrowing feudal absolutism. For example, in British-occupied Iraq, colonial rule would at times preserve and even reconstruct feudal relations while introducing limited industrialization in areas with economic value to the colonizers. For example, in the case of Iraq was the oil industry, creating a local ruling class based on an ostensible feudal tradition, but wholly dependent on imperialist protection. I think this is very nicely put in the way I think Alan Freeman said the other day, imperialism actually backwardized the colonies. The historic task of removing foreign domination and landlord capitalist rule thus became one and fell to the shoulder of the proletariat in alliance with the peasant masses. The incapacity of the bourgeoisie for political action was caused by its hostile relation to the proletariat and the peasantry, and its fear of a shake-up of property relations in any form. The dependency on imperialism resulted in colonial political structures and a partially industrialized economy combined with pre-capitalist social relations. For most of its history, China has one of the largest populations in the world and a unified state with many nationalities. Chinese civilization continues for thousands of years, and the dominant political ideologies have always placed the interest of the majority in the society as a priority in any governing regimes. It doesn't mean that they always do so, but this is the dominant political ideology. With a continuing literary civilization, which has lasted at least 3,000 years, and a recorded history of dynasties founded and destroyed by mass peasant revolt, the dominant political traditions in China have always equated political legitimacy, in Chinese term, mandate of heaven, with the well-being and consent of the immense majority of the population. Resistance against colonial invasions in the mid-19th century first took the form of defending the native political cultural tradition against the foreign barbarians, so-called barbarians, then quickly turned to adaptations of what was perceived to be the most advanced Western ideologies. For example, the Taiping's rebellion, the Taiping's appropriation of Christian millennialism, constitutionalism, various forms of liberalism, etc. The most progressive intellectuals eventually accepted Marxism as their guiding theory in the struggle to save the country from complete disintegration. Imperial China was defeated by Western imperialism in the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1860s. Just as a background information, in the 1840s, when compared to the island, we know what was happening at that time. The Great Famine was taking place. At the same time, the British decided to start the Opium War in China. Consequently, China was forced to sign the unequal treaties, which ceded territories and granted extraterritoriality to the powers. China became a dumping ground of Western manufactures and opium. The West also controlled China's customs revenue and government finance through the so-called custodian banks system, which lasted until 1939. The overthrow of the Manchu imperial dynasty did not give birth to a capitalist republic in the image of the West, which the revolutionaries hoped for, but gave rise to warlordism, where the Western powers carried out proxy wars between their Chinese proteges. The adaptation of Western liberal polity deepened China's national crisis. In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference decided to transfer German colonies in China to Japan, leading to widespread disillusionment with Western, especially American, liberalism, and the beginning of an anti-imperialist national movement marked by the May 4th movement. The left wing of this movement turned to Marxism and founded the Communist Party of China in 1921. It became a section of the Communist International. The Comintern determined that the immediate tasks of the Chinese Revolution were to end feudalism and imperialist domination, and advised the Communist Party to mobilize working people to build a national liberation movement, which would not be socialist in its immediate aims. The Communist Party was instructed to join the landlord bourgeois-led Nationalist Party, the KMT, to effect a national revolution in 1923. The precept that the national struggle against imperialism takes precedence over the class struggle led to the subordination of the communists to the nationalists, and very bloody results. The CP-KMT alliance was fraught from the beginning, as the CP's mobilization of workers and peasants was seen as a deadly threat by most of the KMT leaders, who were landlords and capitalists with links to the imperialist powers. In fact, Sun Yat-sen, most considered as the founder of the modern China, did not propagate his theory of restriction of capital and equalization of rights in the land openly for fear of alienating his allies. Chiang Kai-shek initially posed himself as a supporter of the left and the Soviet Union to outmaneuver his competitors and win supreme power. He then purged and massacred the communists. After leading the huge anti-imperialist May 30th movement and Canton Hong Kong strike in 1925 and 1926, the Communist Party grew from a small propaganda circle, about 50 members at its founding in 1921, into a mass party approaching 60,000 members with significant roots in the working class by 1927. In the countryside, millions of peasants were organized into associations and pushed for reforms and the overthrow of landlordism. The scale and depth of the strikes and the tempo of the CP's expansion alarmed the KMT. At the height of the national movement, shortly after the CP-led workers' armed seizure of Shanghai in April 1927, the right and the quote-unquote left at KMT, in close succession, violently purged the CP, killing more than 300,000 worker and peasant activists, including almost half of the CP's membership at the time. This would be the first of similar massacres perpetrated by bourgeois nationalists against their erstwhile communist allies in the global south. The CP was driven into the countryside and started to build a separate state along Soviet lines. When the KMT renewed its war of extermination against the CP with Western support in 1946, the CP switched from its policy of reducing rent and interest during the war against Japanese aggression into full land redistribution and ending landlordism. The principles of land redistribution and the empowerment of the peasants' committees was codified in the 1947 draft land reform law. Freed from feudalistic bondage and usury and politically empowered, millions of new peasant smallholders volunteered for the CP's armed forces. This turned the tide of the civil war against the KMT, both economically and militarily, and also fatally undermined it politically as its peasant soldiers became supporters of land reform. The imperialist-backed landlord bourgeois KMT state was destroyed and replaced by a CP-led workers' and peasant state. This is the foundation of China's national independence and break from colonial dependency, the beginning of its national industrial development. Ireland did not have a unified, centralized state power, nor a relatively independent political tradition before British colonization. The Irish language has been displaced by centuries of English rule. The native Irish culture had been similarly marginalized. Under British colonial rule, land in the south was largely granted to English adventurers and crown creditors for extensive commercial farming, while the north was entrusted to the settlers from England and Scotland. In the 19th century, machine industry was encouraged to develop with the expansion of the British Empire. Belfast iron shipbuilding was an example of the enclave development in the colonies. Identities which are hostile to each other were being developed and fostered by the differential development of the North and South, to the extent that a significant number of people in the North did not identify themselves as Irish and were opposed to Irish home rule or independence. British rule engendered national identities interwoven with religious sectarianism. which became the key tool of its divide and rule strategies. The working class and capitalist class in the North were largely bounded by unionism. The largely Catholic radical petty bourgeoisie in the South became the mass social force advocating the end of British rule and Irish freedom. Although James Connolly was one of the leaders in the 1916 Easter Uprising, a Marxist who had huge influence among the working class, Marxism had not succeeded in leading the struggle for national independence. The Irish War of Independence, militarily characterized by assassinations, of British state officials and supporters and guerrilla warfare, facilitated a rise of militancy in the Irish working class, with dozens of local general strikes and Soviets proclaimed up to 1922. However, the absence of a powerful Marxist party meant the war ended in a compromise where Britain allowed a partially independent South and partitioned the island along sectarian lines. What became the Republic of Ireland in the South was deeply intertwined with the Catholic Church until fairly recently, while the principle of Protestant supremacy ruled the North until the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Ireland was the template of the later partition of India. Ireland today remains divided. The ideals of the proclamation of 1916 are yet to be realized. Ireland is very different from China, not only in terms of territory and population, but also due to it being a complete British colony for over 400 years. After the Opium Wars, China lost its sovereignty and part of its territories to Britain and other imperialist powers, but the great majority of the Chinese people continued to identify as Chinese. Irish citizens maintained the country's connection with Britain via immigration and residency rights, which shows there cannot be a total separation between the two countries. Ireland also does not have a tradition of large-scale, periodic, successful peasant rebellions like China, which gave China a secular, populist, political, cultural tradition, which has been dominant for most of its history. In Ireland, however, Catholicism served as the medium of national resistance against English colonization, but the sectarianism resulting from centuries of British rule became a main obstacle for national unity and working class political independence. The collapse of the Catholic Church social and political dominance in the South and the weakening of the Orangeism in the North is opening the space for debate on the social and political future of the island of Ireland. Ireland's continuing dependence on British capital and market is now replaced by US-dominated foreign investment. The turn to neoliberalism in the South starting from 1980s, including low corporation tax, deregulation of banking sector, the large-scale privatization, results in large but fluctuating foreign direct investment and sharp increase in economic inequality. The social forces which advocate Irish unity and freedom have been forcibly suppressed by the capitalist state in the North and South until very recently. Due to Ireland's place in the international division of labor, it will be difficult to imagine the achievement of Irish unity, which can overcome the last vestiges of sectarianism and bring equal rights and opportunities for all citizens outside a socialist framework. And for the latter to be on the agenda without revolutionary changes taking place in Britain and Europe. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Sam-Kee, and now we have Carlos. Carlos, do you need some help with?
Yes, I'm just opening his.
Okay. don't think I need my glasses actually. One second.
No problem. Do you need help in
No, all right, thanks. Let me start talking while I do this operation. Thank you for inviting me to this panel, and especially welcome to my hometown, Madrid. It's a pleasure to be at a conference here finally. And I'm going to give you first, 1 minute of background to understand, why I'm presenting this, and to understand where I'm coming from in theoretically, but also empirically. So my main area of expertise is essentially African economic development. I've been working on different issues around structural transformation, broadly speaking, first on agrarian transformations, and more recently, in more recent years, I've been also looking at other kinds of transformation, particularly political economy of industrial development in particular African countries. So I'm not a China specialist. However, over the past 8, 9 years, I have been doing quite a lot of empirical research on the dynamics of Chinese investments in a number of African countries, and particularly in Ethiopia and Angola, 2 of the countries where the presence of both Chinese investors as well as Chinese finance institutions has been fairly prominent. Of course, I have been over time a keen reader of the political economy of China, which is necessary to understand some of these dynamics and therefore the place of China in the global reconfiguration of capitalism. And that, not surprisingly, has had its ramifications in the dynamics of transformations and development in a number of African countries. I wouldn't talk in terms of Africa in general, obviously, but certainly in certain and highly relevant examples of African economic development. So at the moment, I'm trying to put some of this evidence together in the form of a very short book, only 30,000 words, which I'm trying to write if I ever find some headspace for it. So this presentation, in a sense, is a sort of way of framing, the way I'm approaching the book. And the key research question really is a question that has been asked many times in forums on, those who work on China-Africa relations, which is whether, what people now call global China is actually contributing to the aspirations of industrialization in Africa or not. Okay, so this is a question that has been lingering for a number of years. There has been quite a bit of research on these topics, but from quite different theoretical as well as empirical angles. An important aspect of this is collaborative research, it's not just my research, but our research to these issues has been labor. So we've been looking at these questions with a strong labor focus, really looking at how these changes and these transformations are affecting African working classes, in what directions, and what may be the key implications for the future. And of course, the difficulty with this topic is that it is early days. Sometimes you ask research questions about structural transformation and transformations in the working class. These research questions normally require a sort of long-term economic history, social and economic history analysis. But what we do in our research is essentially sort of snapshots of realities on the ground now. So it's one of the big challenges is trying to address some of these questions, but with evidence that is not necessarily sort of long-term historical evidence. So in addressing this broad overall question, what I try to do is to connect 3 interrelated themes for which we use different kinds of literatures, different kinds of insights from different theoretical and empirical viewpoints. First is debates about structural transformation more generally, and particularly debates about the imperative of industrialization, i.e., does structural transformation, and here I'm talking about the African context, require industrialization or not? Is this a necessary step? So this is a debate, and a lot of people are participating in this debate, and certainly my my friend Pritish here, what counts as structural transformation? Do you need industrialization? You know, could something else qualify as that? So, and some people argue that no, I mean, if African economies, African countries want to go through this kind of structural transformation, industrialization must be there, must be at the center, regardless of whether other sectors also are part of the story. The second key thing is employment, labor relations, and particularly the employment challenge that most African societies have been facing now for several decades. And in the process of transformation, something that we know from Marxist political economy of capitalist development is that an important aspect of that process is the building of an industrial workforce. And that's where, when I was saying that it's difficult to ask these questions with snapshots. You take snapshots and what you see is something is going on in the labor market. Doesn't mean that we are witnessing the building of an industrial workforce in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, or in Angola, or is it something that is just temporary and is going to fade in the near future? Whereas we can look at this kind of question when looking at the building of industrial workforce in England, the building of an industrial workforce in Spain, Germany, et cetera, we have plenty of evidence of that. What's interesting is that that historical literature and the work of the likes of Thompson, et cetera, is actually quite relevant still today when we look at what's going on in some of the industrial parks in Ethiopia or some of the sort of industrial, small, medium scale industrial clusters in Nigeria. And that sort of these connections are also important to consider. And the third theme, obviously, which brings me here, is Africa-Asia encounters. It's not just China, but certainly China has been the leading exponent of these new sets of relations and configurations that have become quite central to economic development in many African countries in the last 20 years, okay? And this is shaping not only economic labor market dynamics, but is also shaping economic policy dynamics in some countries. And here, I think one of the main hypotheses with which we started this research was that there is a lot of variation. You know, talking about Africa, China is not particularly useful precisely because there's huge variation across African countries and how these new relations are contributing or not to new kinds of, or what kinds of transformation. And the other hypothesis is actually there is quite a lot of agency that needs to be understood, needs to be empirically probed at the level of policy making, of course, but also at the level of business dynamics, you know, capitalist class dynamics in different countries. Now, on the first theme, I'm going to go fairly fast on the first two, and then I'll move to the last point, which is the main focus of this presentation. So here, I mean, I try to engage with, you know, well-known literature on the political economy of industrialization and transformation, particularly influenced by the work of people like Nicholas Kaldor, obviously Hajun Cheng, or colleague Arkebe Okubai, who was the mastermind of industrial policy in Ethiopia. But certainly, perhaps one of the biggest influences in my understanding of these historical processes of economic transformation is Ali Zamsted. You know, at least that's the one who has influenced some of this thinking and the way I approach these issues for Ethiopia or Angola more concretely. And one of the key things that emerges from this literature is that industrialization remains central to any process of structural transformation. You can also have other processes like the modernization of services, but even the modernization of services is very often linked with processes of industrial transformation. Now, when addressing the question as to whether, you know, African countries are ready to industrialize, this is a question that's still there on the table. There are plenty of questions around structural factors, you know, whether it's, you know, labor force dynamics, demography, geography, natural resources, etc., and of course infrastructure, although that's more than a structural condition. All these matter a lot, and they do explain some of the variation that we see across African countries, and also the differences between African economic dynamics and dynamics in other parts of the global South, but do not always determine the pathways. And this is where variation across countries really teaches a lot about the centrality of agency, you know, how deliberate strategies and deliberate actions to accelerate this process of transformation very often play a major role in changing the existing dynamics. So policy and agency matters, and this is where I bring the idea of Albert Hirschman's possibilism and Amsden anti-determinism. Okay, so these two are guiding ideas that help me understand particularly the contrasts between two very different African economies, this Ethiopia and Angola. Now, in debates on industrialization in Africa, there are very, very different views and some stylized facts that allow us to approach this issue variation from a different vantage point. There may be those who argue that in Africa, actually what we've seen is premature industrialization, i.e. the structural conditions are still not there or were not there when some countries attempted to industrialize in the 1960s and 70s. Whether you look at education levels, savings rates, some basic structural conditions, the argument was that these indicators were not at the level that you found them in other countries that had begun the processes of industrialization. So there's still quite a long, road ahead. There are also those who have used the term premature deindustrialization in the context of debates on industrialization in Africa. Roderick is one of them, it's not the only one. And that's typically been linked to debates, for example, on some economies that did go further in the industrialization efforts, certainly South Africa, but also some other low to middle income African economies, which really went through some early processes of industrial takeover in the 1960s and 70s. And the argument is that the Washington Consensus, the 1980s, 1990s, basically led to a process of premature deindustrialization. Then we can also consider the idea of thin industrialization, i.e. that, yes, some countries are industrializing, or at least showing signs of industrialization, but that success is essentially at the lower end, at the very specific tasks in global production networks. So here we bring in global production networks into the equation and saying actually industrialization processes in the contemporary global south are not the same as the way they happened in 1950s and 60s in other parts of the so-called periphery. And then we could think of, I've used this term contingent industrialization. We actually have different instances of all these dynamics, quite a bit of variation, both across countries, but also over time, i.e. the same country, going back and forth in their efforts. And also interesting if we open it up to other forms of transformation that look like industrialization. And here I use the concept of industrialization of freshness that my colleagues Chris Kramer and others have used when looking at agrarian transformation, transformations within the agribusiness sector, which pretty much look like industrial development. So that leads us to an impasse in a lot of these debates. It's kind of half empty and half full glass. So if we look at proportional manufacturing GDP, and we took aggregate picture of the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, the picture would be, no, Africa is not really industrializing, right? But however, if we take actual rates of growth in manufacturing value added, and in many countries also in terms of in per capita terms, we do see that there has been something going on. And it's interesting that a lot of this growth is happening at the same time as we had the commodity boom. So a lot of these African economies were actually growing that fast, and a lot of the attention was really placed on primary commodity sectors, but actually there was a lot of industrialization has also been going on. So this is something that cannot be ignored. That takes me to the second theme, which is employment, and I'm just going to give you a couple of key ideas here. And is that analyzing this, it's important to have a strong labor focus, to bring employment and labor at the center of analysis. Why? Because industrialization is also about social transformations. And here I would highlight two things that are going on in some of the countries where we have been doing research. And our research has been primarily on labor conditions and employment dynamics. First is that the arrival of many of these new jobs come with new skills are learned, but primarily with new kinds of labor processes, the kinds of labor processes that are associated with industrial development. So therefore, new forms of organizing production and labor, and also new work cultures. So what's really interesting is how in countries like Ethiopia, we see the kind of work culture clashes that Thompson used to talk about in the context of England quite before our eyes. The other key dynamic that we see happening, and in some ways actually more than expected, is how these new jobs, these new dynamics is bringing about new areas of conflict, resistance, and struggles, which shows that the process of industrial transformation and its social dimension is long and certainly not frictionless. What's interesting is how capitalist industrial employers in countries like Ethiopia have found it quite striking the extent to which Ethiopian workers have been very active in terms of strikes, in terms of mobilizing, collective action, and so on, when they had been promised a docile labor force and a low-cost and docile labor force. So that's why bringing labor back into the analysis is absolutely central. So let me just jump, because of a lack of time. These are some pictures from, so we looked at construction work, 5 minutes, and industrial jobs, primarily in light manufacturing, but also in material building material sectors. So in countries like Ethiopia, there has been quite a substantial amount of job creation in the manufacturing sectors. We've seen the spreading of special economic zones, but essentially industrial parks, and huge inflows of internal migration, people coming from rural areas into these industrial parks and basically getting their first industrial jobs, and in a sense, the first non-agricultural jobs in their own experience. In fact, a lot of these workers tend to be young women, in the bracket 18 to 25 years old. So that's where we bring the role of global China in all this. And the concept of global China is important because it shows that China is really at the center of reconfiguration of global capitalism, not only because of what happens within China, i.e. how economic development in China and labor market dynamics in China is affecting global capitalism, but now in the last 20 years also because of these external projection. How Chinese capital, different varieties of Chinese capital have been going out into different spaces, different market spaces, different sectors, and how finance has also contributed to that process of externalization. So that brings about other kinds of new dynamics, primarily in the global south. We're talking different parts of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and also to a lesser extent, Latin America. And within Africa, there's a number of key vectors that have to be analyzed in order to understand this new configuration of relations and how they can potentially and materially affect industrialization aspirations. We do have a discourse of industrial cooperation, but this is fairly new. Okay, in the early days, in the 2000s, Chinese authorities, governments, agencies did not really articulate these relations in terms of a deliberate industrial cooperation. It was more about, business, win-win cooperation and so on. It is more recently that this kind of discourse is emerging, and it's emerging almost as a form of packaging of what has been going on anyway on the ground, which is several inputs into potential processes of industrial development and transformation. And here are the main inputs. And each of these can be analyzed separately, but it's important to see how they are interlinked as well. So one major contribution has been through infrastructure finance and building, direct building. And that particularly in energy sector, so the production and distribution of energy, which is absolutely central to the prospects of industrial transformation. In fact, as many industrial investors were telling us in Ethiopia and Angola, they say the number one reason we invest in this country is because we have cheap electricity that is actually accessible and reliable. We would not invest, forget about the labor force, the low cost of the labor force. It is really electricity that matters. That is the basic primary condition, and then everything else comes after. But also a huge amount of, huge by African standards. And this is something that needs to be put on the table. Huge amount of funding for industrial parks, okay? And of course, this has been quite uneven, okay? In some countries like Ethiopia, there has been a lot of this going on. In other countries, very, very little or nothing. The second key vector is the creation of new jobs and therefore new skills that come from this growth in manufacturing as well as in construction of public infrastructure, okay? And these new jobs are creating the seeds of an emerging working class. These are primarily very young people, and very young people that are very unlikely to go back to the agricultural sector, okay? And the fallback option, obviously, is going back to kind of informal services. But what we see in countries like Ethiopia, this is ever less likely in the context of continuous industrial growth. Then we have foreign direct investments, which is essentially private industrial investors. It's a private Chinese industrial investors coming from all different parts of China and from different sectors, building materials, but primarily also light manufacturing. And then you can see some dynamics of certain regional specialization, certain groups of investors coming from certain countries that are more geared towards particular destinations in Africa, particular sectors, and so on. You see? Access to suitable and affordable technology, that is quite important. There has been a massive change in terms of the production of capital goods, capital equipment in China, and this is now being seen across the board in so many African countries where there used to be total dependence on capital goods primarily from Europe. And quite importantly, in the age of financialization is for the first time, a number of African countries, and this is primarily African governments, have had access to what people call patient capital, patient finance, i.e. long-term maturity finance that is not linked to sort of the dynamics of financial markets or to the restrictions that come from finance that originates from the World Bank, for example. So in that sense, Chinese finance institutions, primarily the Exim Bank, but also Chinese Development Bank, have come as a sort of counterforce to the World Bank and other sources of finance and have really changed the game in a number of African countries. Now, I think, for the purposes of the debate in this session, I have a number of questions, which is, how to interpret these trends and the extent to which the narratives of uneven and combined development are helpful or not. And one could argue that if we look at just trade patterns between China and most African countries, you could say, well, this is just reproducing your old, center periphery scheme, and therefore this is still a fairly relevant and useful framework to analyze China-Africa relations and whether this is leading to any kind of transformation or not. And it could lead to a sort of pessimism, which was typical of the core dependency theory in the 1960s. Some might argue that, well, is this an instance of a new semi-periphery? I find that, when we start using the term semi, means that the concept is not particularly useful. Right? So let's say that, well, if we are going to call Ethiopia now a new part of the semi-periphery, then maybe we should drop the center periphery framework. Now, the problem is that the structural transformations that we've seen in most African countries are happening, but they're highly variegated, and in some cases, they could be seen as contingent. Again, Ethiopia is a case in point. Everyone would have assumed that Ethiopia was on a remarkable industrial path in 2020 before the pandemic hit. And 3 years later now, we find ourselves asking questions about, is that over? Primarily because domestic politics, and how the Ethiopian political settlement has led the country in a direction that might undo some of the progress that had been made in the previous 10 years. So I think perhaps more useful is to situate this debate about the prospect for these industrialization aspirations and, in some cases, the materialization of those aspirations in relation to the concept of global China, i.e. how China is still shaping new configurations of global capitalism, this time not because of what's happening in China itself, but what is happening outside its borders. Whether this is leading to a reproduction of all spatial fixes, i.e. is this yet another instance of a spatial fix in global capitalism, and Chinese companies, finance institutions are just contributing to this new spatial fix, or whether there's another kind of slightly more nuanced interpretation of this event that really is the kind of question that I'm grappling with. As you can imagine, I'm sort of more inclined to move away from very basic and crude center periphery type of dichotomies because I don't find them particularly useful. Not least because if there's one thing that stands out in this empirical analysis is the huge contrast that one can find between a country like Ethiopia and a country like Angola. Angola perhaps conforming to some of these dichotomies, these binaries more neatly, and Ethiopia really not fitting this narrative. So that's really the questions, and I think I'm going to stop there and leave the other of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlos. That was really interesting. Now we have Lorena. How do you should be doing?
Yeah, hi, hello. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides?
Oh, wow.
We need to end this sharing
Okay.
first.
Yeah, can you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Hi, thank you very much for organizing this panel. And I think my presentation does really well with what Carlos has been discussing so far. As I'm looking at another case in Central Asia, so the case of Uzbekistan, and how, yeah, structural transformation can be understood within the recently revised framework of state capitalism, but also vis-a-vis the new wave of investments coming from China through the Belt and Road Initiative. So the context is that, and the problematization of this paper was being recently published with Globalization, is that there was a mislink between the narrative and literature on market transition and the revival debate of state capitalism. And I will explain briefly how and why. So first of all, there was obviously a well-established market transition literature who has kind of depicted the state-market relations as a dichotomic. And there was a classification that has been very well reviewed by a book by Gregorian in 2018 about like those who belonged and they follow the so-called shock therapy or Big Bang approach based on the Washington consensus, which followed the fiscal discipline, removal of subsidies, financial and trade liberalization, capital account liberalization, and we know the whole package. And those who follow the gradual approach to the transition. And those were kind of explored mostly in the context of China. We all know the famous book by Bella Weber that she published a couple of years ago. So we know theoretically that these two strategies are aligned to diverse epistemology and ideological approach, which see and conceive social relations of production and exchange in a completely different way. So we know that without going through the Washington consensus and then being further conceptualized and refined nowadays with the Wall Street consensus, where Daniela Gabor studies how financial governance, international financial governance has further pushed away, the sovereignty of capital accounts and sovereignty of monetary policies. But on the other side, we really in this paper I really wanted to kind of understand, taking a step backward, how private ownership and transition in general towards what we call markets and marketization was perceived as a unidirectional kind of a horse race, especially because like empirical evidence like China and other case studies, but also the revival debate of state capitalism has shown that a combination of public planning and hybrid accumulation have led and can lead to higher level of socioeconomic growth, less volatility in the regimes of private accumulation, less inequality at some point, and avoided the automation of the market. So marketization has been proved in many cases that adopted the shock therapy as not a sufficient condition to a successful transition to the market economy. From a theoretical point of view, what has been overlooked is, first of all, that this transition has multiple directions and has to be analyzed at multiple scale. And here, a very useful framework is the strategic relational approach by Jessop, and how the state can actually have this kind of multi-layer coordination role. The second point is about the timing, and we have been, I mean, Carlos touched upon a little bit, but time matters when and how to privatize or liberalize. And also like the pace, so the intensity of such reforms, which would like either accelerate or slow down these waves of private accumulation. So we know that with the debate of Allan and Dixon and all the Dutch school, let's say now, there is a return of fashion of these upgraded forms of state market hybrid institution. But the point of this paper is that there wasn't, is not something that it comes out of the bucket, but it has to be understood as an historical continuum, especially when looking at regions of the world who have been ideologically and politically embedded within a state capitalist framework or a socialist framework, whatever you want to call it. Within this framework, we can't analyze market transition or marketization as a black box, but rather we need to understand what are the context-specific strategies of accumulation and distribution over time. And this is basically crucial to identify source of surplus and distribution of outputs of private accumulation especially. So structural transformation, which is like a very useful lens as we all know, is basically very good to assess how these dynamics of accumulation plays out across sectors, and also in the important development mechanism, which is like obviously created through labor, working conditions, and creation of employment. I'm gonna be very brief in this because it's something very specific to the literature of Soviet debates on accumulation, but it's something that is like, it really makes us think about how do we develop and where this surplus comes from. And there is a nice quote that it was actually employed during this debate in the Soviet Union, when if the main source of capitalist primitive accumulation is the colonies for many regions of the world, in the Soviet states, the outside resource was the Soviet village, so the non-socialist village. And this was the surplus extraction actually implemented at the expenses of agriculture. So uneven exchange and what we call price scissors was between like agricultural goods and non-agricultural goods, through a system of internal taxation was considered one of the main source of extraction of surplus, therefore capital formation and industrialization. And this is very important because countries like China, but also Uzbekistan have implemented and have been implementing this tool 20 years ago, basically, so not so long ago. There was obviously different, as I said, epistemological and ontological understanding of what the distribution and taxation and prices and fiscal policy meant, which were completely different from the Washington Consensus stories. And the idea was that there was no focus on productivity. Financial repression was not considered like absurd, And there was a kind of a consensus that private consumption, internal private consumption was kept down. So what happened in the Uzbek case? In the first, Uzbekistan became independent together with all the other Central Asian countries and Soviet Union in between 1989 and 1991 as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since the beginning, rejected the shock therapy approach and implemented this uneven exchange with agriculture, which led to foreign exchange accumulation by exporting commodities, in particular cotton. There was also, like, thanks to a gradual and selective privatization, which basically let the small go and the big and strategic stay in the public sphere. So all the services, housing and telecommunication went gone, but they retained public ownership of upstream sectors such as land, natural resources, and infrastructure. Trade relations were based on geopolitical bilateralism, regionalism. They are still actually in negotiation, for instance, with the WTO. As I said, obviously, they implemented import substitution and a very detailed system of public procurement for very strategic commodities such as wheat, which also kept, for instance, sensitive, stable food prices such as bread and flour control, and gas also control. So also a very slow process of price liberalization. They kept a stable surplus of the current account, also thanks to currency restriction on convertibility and profit repatriation for foreign direct investment. So two main examples of how this was implemented in two strategic commodities. One was cotton, and this is the usual story of the pre-neoliberal reform. So state monopoly, farmers were imposed forced quota on volume, location, and quantity of cotton to be sold to the state, but they were at the taxed price, so which was inferior to the commercial and international price. But in exchange, they had subsidies, and there is a huge discussion about mobilized labor for picking cotton, which has been resolved in recent years. But if you're curious about, because Uzbekistan is famous only for that, I can talk about this later. And they also have a very kind of wealth of minerals, including gold and gas, which are sold to the international market and allowed foreign currency to be accumulated, foreign exchange to be accumulated. Another very interesting story that allowed this process and patterns of state-led accumulation is been through wheat commodities, which is a very similar story to the Chinese modes of taxation. So it was a political objective to create self-sufficiency for wheat. So in order to, maintain stable price of food. And this was implemented into a semi-quota system, public procurement, and fixed price at the internal procurement level. This has created two outcomes. First of all, the reduction of the use of foreign currency to buy imports from international market, and improved indicators of food security, especially in remote rural areas, also considering the population pressure. So Uzbekistan, as many other countries in this stage of development, is having a very, very high intensive natality rate. So what has been the process and the consequences and the patterns of this? Obviously, there are many contradictions and many pitfalls within then specific sectors and inefficiencies and dysfunctionalities. But if we contextualize Uzbekistan in the big trends of development of the past 20 years, we've seen that the indicators are not that bad. So GDP per capita has been increasing. GDP has doubled in 15 years. There is a low public debt. They have a pretty satisfactory human development index. Inequality in the first 15 years of the independence was quite low. And overall, the value added of industry and manufacturing increased with a stable, although slow, diversification of industrial sectors, which is what we
5 minutes, Lorena. 5
yes,
minutes.
yes, structural transformation. So, what happened then? In 2016, there'd been a change of government, and there was also the awareness that this uneven exchange, internal uneven exchange, was not enough anymore to guarantee capitalistic growth as we know it, and therefore the need to activate this process of private accumulation, which happened through internationalization and opening up of the economy. This was pushed by both internal factor and external factor. The first one was very similar to what we heard before. There is an emerging urban middle class, young, quite educated, because Uzbekistan comes from, benefits from the legacy of the Soviet Union. So they have quite high literacy rates that demand higher wages, jobs, and also liberal change. And this employment needs capital infrastructure to be absorbed. So they need to integrate to technology and have strategic integration with global value chain. But also there is an external determinant, and I quote here, Lagarde was at the 2019 visit to Uzbekistan, who was at the time the head of the IMF, and he said, okay, you're growing, you're done well, but will this investment be channeled to the most competitive and profitable firms? There's been a constant question in Uzbekistan. This answer is yes, if the price is right. So there's been a constant push by international organizations, international financial institutions to liberalize market capital account and prices, which eventually is happening. The further push was actually this huge credit offer and supply and investment in infrastructure and energy coming from China. So, to make a long story short, as a result of all these pressures, there was a liberalization and market-oriented reforms happened and implemented since 2017, including import tariff cuts, price liberalization, foreign exchange liberalization, which also created a condition for foreign direct investments to be attracted and also able to repatriate their profits. There's been a lot of commission established for privatization, demonopolization, which followed also the push for the Western corporate governance models, and like this idea of the realization of joint stock companies that attract foreign direct investments. So, but this was also considered with more hybrid forms of foreign economic zone, special economic zone, which was partly supported by new commercial banks, also foreign, especially Eastern and Soviet, like Russian and Hungarian banks now are present, and a process of urban land privatization, not rural. How does China sits in this? So the big question that everybody asking across the world is that is BRI, is Chinese investment, are Chinese intervention opportunity for structural transformation? So it is an obvious fact that the trade volume between China and Uzbekistan increased like massively over the past years, and China became the first trade partner of Uzbekistan in agriculture, energy, and many commodities. There was a very strong linkages that established with China, not only strictly economic, but also in what we call soft power, so technological transfer and cooperation. And there has been very effective investments who already are visible and tangible in the country. For instance, there is a part in the eastern part of the country, very mountainous and very problematic to build infrastructure that actually Chinese were very successful to implement. And also establish a memorandum of understanding cooperation in hybrid forms of lending and manufacturing sector. So what is the, I mean, I leave this and I conclude here with the more of a questions than answer, because as we all know, these are very long processes that requires like further assessment to be, you know, like judged. But we all know that like the radical lessons is that structural transformation can be achieved only with particular by taking care and considering the timing and directions and specific context in which is implemented, because there is no direct link, for instance, by virtuous circular credit coming from abroad and established domestic demand and employment. There are many contradictions in it. We already discussed this with Carlos. At the same time, what is the endogenous kind of urban middle class in the country? We know that if the alternative to that is becoming only like keeping domestic kind of capital being the driver of development, we know that this is still weak. At the same time, we don't want global economic powers to be predatory in the country. So that's also a fine balance to monitor. And yeah, foreign direct investment in China are becoming the main players, also for the good governance story that we can discuss later on if you want. So the state is still closely involved in the process of accumulation. And also, if you look at the nitty-gritty details, it still keeps private capital accumulation particularly and localized in very specific sectors. So the question that is becoming very crucial in not only in Uzbekistan but in Central Asia and maybe in other contexts as well is whether there has been, you know, these beneficiaries countries have been able to play with different stakeholders and different financial players, or have been kind of felt like attacked for multiple fronts. And yeah, I don't have an answer for that. This is the paper, is open access if you want to read it, and thank you.
Okay, thank you for 3 great presentations. I think we have about 25 minutes, so we can take questions, and ideally 2 or 3. But anyone has any questions? Sorry? Oh, great. So yeah. You please say your name as well and your affiliation.
Get close to that.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Tomas. I'm from Brazil. I would like to address a question to the work of Carlos. It's a very interesting talk. I mean, as I'm from Brazil, I also have some work in this kind of the same perspective to Latin America. So I have a lot of questions and doubts about how you are, because on your presentation, which is very, it sounds more like introductory questions about what's happening, and I don't know if you would be able to give me some I don't know, preliminary conclusions that what are your findings on the research, because when you're presenting, you talk a bit about I would say mechanization of the agriculture, because you said that there's some kind of industrialization on the agriculture sector, but how this could be related to improve of the economic structure, because we're talking about a sector that's different from the industrial sector, no? And it's mainly, for example, the case of Brazil, because we have like a high technology mechanics industry in the agriculture sector, but that doesn't mean that we are industrializing in some sense. And how does it happen in the case of the countries in NAFTA that you're studying? And you showed some data from employees, which is very interesting. And but I'm in doubt because you showed like absolute terms, and I was curious about the share of the population, what that means. And the third question is about investments, because I also work with foreign direct investment, the Chinese policy for foreign direct investment, and foreign direct investment in Brazil, in Latin America countries, because as you may know as well, Brazil became more like top 5 world global receiver of foreign direct investment, mainly investment from China, US, and Europe, but China had a big hold on that, on the rise of Brazil on the ranking list. But that not necessarily means that's a benefit for the country. And how are you looking to that on the case of African countries? Because national policies is important. Well, that's it for now. Sorry for
Okay, that's a question, Sam-Kee.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks a lot for the presentations, which is really great and open our horizon to different areas. First question is for Carlos. Is global China, in what's your terms used there, is it equivalent to imperialist China? If not, then what are the differences? Second one is about the case study, for example, in Ethiopia. You said the workers' activism is actually quite a lot there. So wanted to ask if these activism still within the spheres of like trying to get better terms and conditions in the workplace, so it's still quite localized, or are they starting to have some political demand? For example, are they a resistant force to neoliberalism? Because in Ethiopia, neoliberalism actually is still quite influential. I think, is it before the Civil War, there actually was planned for privatization, telecommunications, and even the airlines. I don't know if they eventually happened, but yeah, so there was a drive for neoliberalism. So for the workers' activism in Ethiopia, were they aware of this and are they against this? The second question is for Lorena. Thank you. Wonder if you have looked at the capital formation figures in the country, because quite often when we want to see whether the accumulation is going into productive investment, we look at capital formation. So don't know if you have any data on that. And you also mentioned that there was a turn to private accumulation from the 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So for this turn, is this an additional to the existing accumulation that you termed as primitive socialist accumulation, or is it at the expense of the primitive socialist accumulation, which perhaps is in the form of privatizing the state asset, so the accumulation that tends to go to the state corporate then go into the private? So wanted to know if this is the case, or if it's not, then yes, what it is. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you all for the presentations. My question is for Carlos. So you mentioned that the people are migrating from the rural areas and taking their first industrial jobs, especially women are experiencing in the industrial sectors for the first time. So I wonder whether we can apply that perspective of variation and agency that you use for different countries' experiences, for different experiences of these people, the working class laborers as well. So I assume that, you know, they have varying experiences in Ethiopia and Angola, and as well as within Ethiopia, for example, if they are working in the construction sector, that would be different for men and women as well. Yeah. If you know, think about the social reproductive work, yeah, which should be continuing for women. So whether it's, you know, a homogenizing, commonizing experience, or can we talk about the variance and agency in this labor's experiences as well?
And I have a question for Sam-Kee as well. So I was quite intrigued by your choice to use the Irish case to contrast the Chinese case. Could you talk a little bit more? I may have just lost it, but why you chose to contrast the two cases like that? So I think what we'll try to do is start with Lorena, so from the back. So Lorena, Carlos, and then Sam-Kee, and we'll hopefully try to keep some time. So try to keep your answers like 3 to 3 minutes if possible. Lorena, you want to start?
Yes, hi. Okay, thanks. I'll be very quick. So capital formation, yes, it increased drastically after 2016. So after the starting of the liberalization of the reform, there has been obviously a collapse due to COVID crisis. So it's also very tricky at the moment to establish a pattern or trend, because obviously there has been a huge shock in the middle of this transition. So let's see in the near future what happens. And yeah, I didn't understand the question about private accumulation and whether it's something like, can you repeat quickly?
Yes, is it at the expense of the state accumulation, for example?
Okay, yeah, no, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, the point is that generally speaking, there has been an expansion, but yes, there has been obviously one of the sectors that is very interesting to follow, and I'm writing about it, is the gas sector, because has been, you know, the generation, processing and distribution of the gas was part of a unique public entity, which has now been, you know, incorporated and created into 3 bodies and partially privatized in various components of the value chain. So we definitely lost some of the strategic asset and capital of the state. But there is a overall expansion. So that's also the question that we need to answer in the medium long term, to understand what has been the consequences of this privatization. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lorena. Carlos, you have a lot of questions, but it's
I go there or here?
I think you're here. Lorena, can you hear Carlos?
Hello, can you hear me?
I actually can.
Yeah.
Yes, very well.
Okay. Yeah, you can hear.
So sorry, I couldn't take notes, so I'll try to remember. Forgive me if you get the question. So your first question is the main findings. Okay, it's very difficult to bet. Let me give you just the headline finding. So the Ethiopia-Angola contrast was very useful in terms of actually showing almost extreme variation. So in both countries, you do see a huge presence of both the Chinese finance and infrastructure building, but also, you know, incoming investors. But huge variation in the nature of these investments. And I think the key confounding factor is the role of the state and whether there's an industrial policy or not. So up to 2020, and I'll connect to Sam-Kee's question, there was a very proactive and probably a unique industrial policy in Ethiopia by African standards. There's no other country with this kind of proactiveness, coordination, resources, and so on. Which meant that when you look at this presence of Chinese firms and finance and so on, in the case of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian state managed to direct the process, right? So, and the Ethiopian state, one of the big priorities was to basically induce an industrial transformation that was already export-oriented, Ethiopia's main problem at the time was foreign exchange constraints. It was a foreign exchange constrained economy. The agricultural sector, and it's very dependent on the agricultural sector. So there's no mineral wealth, oil, or anything like that. So the Ethiopian state say, well, that's really what we need. And they deliberately used Chinese sources of finance, and not only Chinese sources of finance, actually other sources of finance like the World Bank and other agencies, to devote the resources, for example, to the construction of industrial parks, to the huge upgrading of the electricity infrastructure, railway, basically connectivity with the Djibouti, which is the main outlet for the exports and so on. So all that led to quite a remarkable growth. I mean, let's say, you know, when you look in percentage terms, it's pointless because it's very, very small, right? But we're starting from zero, basically. You know, the industrial sector in Ethiopia was non-existent in 2010, almost non-existent. And now we have, you know, 10 industrial parks with, you know, dozens of companies before the war, which were operating. And there was a path towards a continuous growth. So for African standards and given the time frame, that was actually really remarkable. So I would consider that as quite a substantial contribution to sort of at least the aspiration to industrialize, the early days of industrialization, but yet, you know, still, you know, very, very early days. And indeed, what happened later on was that a lot of this, some of this was undone by the conflict. Angola, on the contrary, is the opposite. No industrial policy to speak of, absolutely no interest on the part of the government. So, although there is a discourse of diversification, because, you know, the elites in Angola realized that depending on oil, especially after the 2015 crisis, was a serious problem. But that discourse has never materialized in an effective policy framework to drive this process. So what happens there is that, yes, there is some industrial development, but that industrial development is essentially induced by demand, i.e. the construction boom in Angola basically led to a huge demand for building materials. And at some point, Angola could not continue importing everything from China, steel, cement, etc. And local elites actually saw an opportunity there, right? So the political settlement was such that certain factions of the local elite, the one connected to the Dos Santos network, so, well, actually, what if we use some of the money that we're stealing from Sonangol to build a cement factory? And let's call Chinese investors to help us set it up because we don't know how to do it. So that's how these things started happening. And it wasn't just with Chinese investors, also with Brazilian investors, by the way, who also came and, you know, or Brazilian expats, managers who came. And so the industrial sector that is developing in Angola is essentially a construction-induced industrial sector. So inward-oriented, not export-oriented, and very much dependent on public investment infrastructure. So quite vulnerable, you know, to these barriers. But it's still industrial development. So that the key variable there is industrial policy and the drive towards industrial policy. So in Ethiopia, to your question on activism and so on, we do have an article in World Development on the politics of labor relations and strikes in the early days of industrialization in 2017 to 2020. And we argue there that there was a mix of genuine labor grievances, i.e. Many workers, even though they did have no experience whatsoever in industrial jobs, many were women and so on, they were a bit surprised because they expected better conditions. So, I mean, they were coming from rural area, from villages and extremely low productivity, but they were promised, you know, these fancy modern industrial parks, and they expected not only a stable salary, this was the news for them. You know, suddenly you get a monthly pay, but also that was by Ethiopian standards, it would be something, you know, high, really high. And they found themselves with base salaries that were extremely low, even by Ethiopian standards. So that was a cock-up, and that was partly the government was to blame for that, because they thought there's no minimum wage in Ethiopia, and the government doesn't want a minimum wage. And they thought, you know, the companies will adapt and they will start paying bonuses. But, you know, these workers were not used to overtime and bonus culture, which is typical of the apparel industry. So you had all these apparel investors coming to Ethiopia with their ways of working in Asia and thinking that Ethiopian workforce would adapt to these very quickly, and didn't happen. So that sort of initial friction, period of friction, which, by the way, E.P. Thompson, many others have talked about. And in Asia, in Southeast Asia, you have very similar kinds of situations where people are shocked, not only by the low wages, but also by the industrial work culture. Be sitting in a table for like 8-10 hours, doing the same repetitive task under artificial light and so on. So all that created a huge shock for many. So there were genuine labor grievances, which were underpinned some of these mobilization. A lot of it was not union-led, trade union-led. So it was, but that was mixed with dynamics of political resistance to the ruling regime back in 2016. So, and this political resistance and political mobilization was partly a result of the fragility of the political settlement in Ethiopia, where ethnic fractionalization was actually embedded even in the constitutional settlement from 1991. And it was partly for all the kinds of reasons we can't go into. But it was a ticking bomb in a sense. It was always a ticking bomb. And by 2016, 2017, you got this situation where you got all these different opportunities, but they were unevenly distributed. And the Ethiopian political logic was that, if you're going to create industrial jobs or industrial parks, you've got to distribute them evenly everywhere. And if that doesn't happen, people are going to be really pissed off, right? And so interestingly, the success itself, the job creation that came with these industrial parks, etc., was instrumentalized by political opposition to further mobilize. So there was a kind of combination of movement against the regime, against the ruling regime, partly along ethnic lines, but also connected to labor grievances. So the fact that what we were promised is not what's happening. So and it wasn't really a revolt against neoliberalism, because in reality, the first attempts to go in that direction really start with the latest prime minister, but only after 2019, 2020. And there's a lot of resistance, even Ethiopian Airlines, to be privatized, really, really difficult. The financial sector, again, they're getting there. So there's certainly a trend in that direction, because ideologically, the new elite is very much in favor of that. And, they have backers from the financial markets, from the financial sector. But all that has been obviously disrupted by the conflict from 2020, right? So even those neoliberal reforms, are struggling, partly because of the dynamics of the conflict and the implications of the sanctions and so on and so forth. So I think that there is a genuine labor mobilization that has been happening. Now, it's receded a little bit also because some might argue that this was normal in the early stages. And in fact, the last time we spoke to industrial investors, what they say, actually turnover is not as bad as it was at the beginning. People are, now we basically got rid, that's how I put it, we got rid of those who would not adapt to the industrial culture. Now those who stay are people who are just going to basically move from company to company, but they're not leaving the sector, right? Because they got used to, the labor process itself final question, your question on variation, in this, there is a lot of variation. Certainly the different industrial sort of developments in Ethiopia and Angola means that the labor forces are very different. Okay, so as I say, 78% of the labor force in these apparel factories in Ethiopia were young women coming from rural areas. Most of them first non-agricultural jobs. So it's a classic example of, and some of them. In Ethiopia, you have a different dynamic, which is some very young women, what they want is to get cash through these jobs. It could be in factories, it could be in flower farms, in agribusiness, to save enough to migrate to the Middle East and work in domestic service. It's a bit shocking, isn't it? But the reality is that they think they're going to, in cash terms, they're going to be much better off by getting a job in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia and being abused and exploited, as they say, than working in a factory in Hawassa or something like that. So, but that used to be, that was the first stages. Now it seems to be less common. So this kind of stepping stone framework. Whereas, so in Angola, for example, given the types of sectors and jobs that have been created, minimal presence of women. So what you get is different segments of the Angolan workforce. And what was interesting, what we found really interesting is that unlike Ethiopia, in Angola, we did find a dormitory labor regime favored by Chinese firms, both in factories and in construction. Okay, the kind of dormitory labor regime that you have in certain parts of China, been reproduced in Angola, but not in Ethiopia. The reason was partly because of the difficulties of operating in Luanda and finding the kind of workforce that they needed, especially for small, medium-sized factories, you know, very tight margins. The salaries, actually, the level salaries in Luanda were too high from these companies. And they discovered, interestingly, in Angola, an old colonial pattern, which was that people from Planalto, from the central south of the country, were traditionally seen as disciplined laborers. That comes from the history of forced labor in plantations, in coffee plantations in Angola. And many Chinese firms adopted this course, this kind of vision, and they started literally bringing workers from these regions, okay, some internal migrant workers, and housing them in the factories in the outskirts of Rwanda. So they created a dormitory labor regime to address a serious labor shortage problem. So we found a very segmented labor force. So those who were working in these dormitory labor regimes were very young, rural origin workers, male workers, mostly, very, very few women. Very different from the industrial workers of Angolan, Portuguese, Brazilian factories in the same areas where they didn't have a dormitory labor regime, their salaries were higher, but also the cost of living for those working in these other factories were much higher. So Angola is a very peculiar place when it comes to understanding labor conditions and labor market segmentation, precisely because of the distortions that Luanda brings into that picture.
Quickly, the question of global China, is it influence China?
No, it's not. There's two ways of looking at this concept of global China. There's kind of two different understandings. One is looking at these processes of externalization. So basically dealing with overaccumulation in China, within China. You know, what's this kind of escape valve for overaccumulation, particularly in sectors such as building materials, for example. You know, given the infrastructure dynamics and sector dynamics and so on, and light manufacturing or low technology manufacturing. So the new normal in China means that there needs to be an escape for these. They either disappear. Automation doesn't seem to be the solution, and therefore, you know, going out, as you know, is the whether that is a process that is deliberately state directed or not. I think it's not totally entirely clear. I mean, this was the usual narrative that the government was driving this. Actually, there is a lot that is happening in the private sector without any connection with the Chinese government, direct connection with the Chinese government. So I would say, you know, this is kind of a typical sort of old-style spatial fix, where, you know, you have different varieties of Chinese capital trying to find ways out and dealing with the overaccumulation problem. And then there's the other notion of global China, which is as a method, okay? So understanding or analyzing China beyond this idea of Chinese exceptionalism, in China and its particular characteristics and exceptionalism, is China at the center of global capitalism, right? And as I said at the beginning, it means that as a method, it requires an analysis of what is happening in China now. I mean, changes, for example, in its production structures, changes in the labor market, and so on and so forth. What are the implications of these for the rest of the world, for capitalism as a whole? So if China, for example, ceases to be the manufacturing powerhouse and ceases to concentrate such a large, significant proportion of industrial employment on a global scale, what is that going? Okay. And the second thing is this externalization of Chinese capital, the implications that this has for capitalist development in other parts of the global south, okay? Whether that is going to replicate the sort of capitalist development that has happened in China or not. But I don't think seeing this through the lens of imperialism is actually useful. It distracts from the empirical realities that we need to understand.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll be quick with my answer. The reason I chose this Ireland and China is because they are both subject to British colonialism. Ireland is the first colony of British colonialism, and Hong Kong is the last. So they have the linkage there, and it is the snapshot of the beginning of the struggle against British imperialism and then to China, and the different outcomes. So there are some lessons learned from the Chinese history, revolutionary history, and also from Ireland as well. Yeah, because quite a lot of the talks about this Chinese model, we can sum it up, it's not the best term, but then Chinese model can be replicated to other countries. I think it's very important to go back to the root to see how it began, how it started. It's with the revolutionary, with a socialist political program that's led by the Communist Party that is against anti-imperialist. So it is an anti-imperialist led movement, and then with a socialist agenda. So, and all the things, national development, independence came after that. So we cannot forget about how it began at the start, and then think that, okay, the policies that they now adopt now can replicate it and with the same outcome. So I think that is why I wanted to highlight the revolutionary history in China, and also compared with other former British colonies, how they struggled and the outcomes, how they are different. So it's just still the beginning of my research. The relevance or how the implications or everything that's the meaning after all these comparisons. I think I'm still in the learning process, so I find it very important, especially with the case of Hong Kong, which can be seen that has some resemblance of how Britain left Ireland, the sectarianism, the ideology in Hong Kong, and the people in Northern Ireland who do not identify themselves as Irish. And some of the Hong Kong people, they don't identify themselves as Chinese. So there are lots of similarities. So I wanted to look into the history in Ireland to try to see whether we can find some answers to that.
Okay. Well, actually, we end at 10:45, right?
Yes.
So I think we are already 5 minutes over time. So if you do have any more questions, I mean, you can speak to the speakers separately perhaps, but I guess we should move on for the next session. But thanks so much. Nice session.
It's my first time seeing Patricia. It's nice. We only communicate on email.